We're going to move on now to our third and final presenter, the 2013 President's Silver Medal for Best Design Work produced in the course of RIBA Part 2 qualification or equivalent, and this went to Ben Hayes, also from the Bartlett School of Architecture, who's going to present his project, Kizzy Island. Ben.
So the project's titled Kizzy Island, and the proposal is for a museum landscape that seeks to facilitate the restoration and protection of over 200 wooden Orthodox churches in Russia onto Kizzy Island in the Republic of Karelia in northern Russia. In the next 10 to 15 years, currently, a large majority of these churches almost have disappeared. And that's really due to lack of maintenance, lack of funding, and also due to that rich history which has led them to be in the position they're in. The project really developed out my initial research into the Russian landscape and national identity. And I was looking at different influences from Romanticism in the late 19th century to the wide-scale impact of Soviet occupation, collectivization, state-run farms in rural areas, to the current deruralization and impacts of urbanization. Looking for that research, what really gripped me was landscape painting, and in particular this landscape painting by Isaac Levitan, painted in 1894, which is really one of the most famous depictions of the Russian landscape still today. And really, what I was fascinated by, which is kind of researching and looking into this image by Levitan, is that it was highly constructed. Like many of the paintings of that time, even by the Perevichniki. And this idea of landscape that Levitan was trying to sell was really highly constructed. And in this image, the church was taken from one place, the lake from another, and the landscape was really kind of fabricated around that to get this sense of sublime sereneness of the Russian landscape, of architecture and landscape and religion. So I was interested in this separation between this kind of scenographic, aestheticized approach to an idea of landscape and actually kind of the reality and a more dialogical approach to landscape. So I looked at these images by Bilibin, and again, highly constructed, completely different style, but again, kind of finding a glory within the Russian landscape. So I started looking at kind of the rich history and the layers found in some of these paintings and how they actually dictated how the Russian people thought of their landscape. And many of these paintings traveled between cities and small imagery. Even today, you can walk through Moscow and they'll have kind of over graffiti, they'll have these kind of mocked up canvas paintings, these similar paintings. So as imagery, it's still very rich. So looking over in particular the Russian north, and as I said before, the influence of collectivization and state-run farms, I was fascinated how these two different stories were kind of running simultaneously, especially the latter was not really being shown potentially today. And currently, this is the situation surrounding the Russian north. There are many, as a result of collectivization, state-run farms, a lot of areas farms have been kind of killed out. And there are many churches, over 200 in the Russian north, that are in a very similar position to this one. There's no one left to maintain them because these farms have been run out, people have been moved to the cities, urbanization. Yet there's very little that's being done to preserve them and protect them. So, as a proposal, I was really interested in trying to create some sort of architectural intervention that could facilitate the protection and restoration of some of these churches. And I was kind of poised with the question of do you kind of restore them in the situation they're in, or is that kind of too late? And the areas they're kind of in the remote north, there's no one to maintain them, so you could restore them, but the same thing, these churches are timber, and they're under a constant state of maintenance. They're constantly being, roofs, cupolas, domes, they're constantly being restored. They need a lot of maintenance. So I started doing a series of surveys around the area and looking at all the different areas and churches that could possibly be restored, and looking at a method of disassembling them and shipping them to a specific site and reassembling there, where Syria could be used as a repository to restore them, to facilitate them, to exhibit them, and give them a new life. So the site became Kiji Island. Kiji Island already has a few wooden Orthodox churches and a few other wooden buildings that have been disassembled and reassembled for their protection in the 50s. Yet, since then, not really much has been done to the rest of the churches outside, and it's kind of become this haven, this small open-air museum where these churches are kind of restored not particularly well, but there's this growing gap between this kind of aestheticized version of the past, which is on the island, and then the reality of what's going on with all the other 200 churches and communities that are losing their churches. So my project, my proposal kind of started looking at other open-air museums. This is a series of studies of other open-air museums around the globe and how they've grown, and what are the more successful ones are the ones that have adapted, and they've had a dialogue with the existing area and buildings and different types of architecture have been brought in and given back. And the least successful ones are the ones that kind of have become stagnant and don't really respond to the world around them. They've just become this kind of archive that has no dialogue to the surrounding areas. So I began collecting a lot of data for these churches in the surrounding areas of Russia, Murmansk, Archangel, and Karelia, and started looking the way in which they're constructed. And the beauty about how they're constructed is that the high level of craftsmanship, they'll only use one axe and they're all slotted together. So there is an ease to disassemble and reassemble them. There are no nails, the joints are kind of are very specific to slot in from kind of bottom up. Creating a survey, I was looking three-dimensionally, but I was also looking in sectional form, and looking at what type of architectural intervention I need on the island to bring all these parts of churches onto the island by ship, and to reassemble them, restore them, research them, and protect them, and what type of architecture would allow for that. So I started doing a typological survey of all these church forms, and this is one of them, to try and find an architecture that would be appropriate onto this island, that would be very much informed by the things they're restoring. And I designed a series of buildings, the first being these restoration hangars, which in total there's 5 of them. And the design was very much based on cataloguing all the different churches I proposed to bring onto the island to be restored, and then dividing them in types. So we have 5 different hangars, custom built to a specific type of church based on their form. And the architecture was purely informed by the form, by the church within them. And this idea actually came from a story I heard when I was on Kiji Island, which was this 16th century church that was needed to be restored over the winter because the roof came in. And what they devised was to build another church outside it. It no longer exists, but that was kind of the precedent for this kind of development of this kind of language and style. That essentially you have some sort of outer skin which is very much almost like a nave of a church, but is really designed for the restoration and the roofing while this process goes on. The roof is also habitable for the craftsmen, but in the future, the proposal plans to, as all these churches brought on, the tourism will be increased and there'll be more revenue to fund these churches, so that the visitor can come and actually inhabit these roofs around the restoration process, to be more engaged with the church. So it's kind of looking in 2 scales, and the top sketch was again looking at these kind of small specific buildings where they're dealing with the restoration, whether it's for the outside of the church or it's for the internal iconostasis or ceiling paintings. And then the bottom sketch looking at a larger scale of getting new materials in, where to store old materials, and what's happening to these churches as they're brought onto the island, how are they exhibited on the island. So this is the island's about 5.5 kilometers long. a situated restoration facility up onto the northwest, purely because of that's where shipping routes already exist. It's quite deep there and it's quite shallow on the islands. But the layout is to have a series of restoration hangars that will allow these all these materials and artifacts to come off the boat onto these docks to be restored. They kind of maintain a liminal quality to allow for this, and then they're brought through onto the island in parts to further research centres, laboratories for ceiling paintings, and a permanent museum on the island. This is a section through one of those hangars. So the architecture was very much informed by the process that I was setting out in the strategy to try and restore so many churches in such a short period of time. So this is one of the icon workshops and archive, which need to be fully contained because of the ceiling paintings. Icons are much more fragile, especially to the weather. And there's also a series of temporary buildings that I began designing, which will also facilitate the maintenance around the island. Seeing that the hope is to curate all these churches around, like from the north to the south, in some kind of flexible arrangement. Permanent and temporary structures will be necessary. So the next stage of the process was thinking about, well, once these churches are bought and restored, what happens with them? And when I visited Peach Island, my first impression was in awe and of such beautiful architecture. But also there was a kind of false sense of the picturesque that had been created. And since the 50s, these few buildings that are existing on the island, they were arranged by two men at one point in time, and they're kind of now which was very much based on kind of a picturesque approach that they thought a church here, a church here. No really thought of what happens when more churches come on. So what you really get is this kind of mishmash of all these churches from different locations, but they're kind of fixed in this aestheticized kind of version of the past, without kind of possible future curation. So my approach to the island was thinking, once these churches are on, can I create a kind of a light infrastructure which will treat the island as kind of a blank exhibition space, where an ongoing curation process can be achieved over a large period of time. And if churches are brought on, restored and exhibited, some might be permanent because they have no homes to go back to, but some might stay there for a period of time and then be disassembled and put back to their original locations. So I was looking at the timeline process, predominantly in a series of drawings, and also looking on the large scale kind of master plan of the island, and how this curation process might work, without prescribing exactly where all these artifacts might go, but kind of increasing the chance and possibility that perhaps these churches, a set of buildings might be disassembled and reassembled in their original arrangement, location, or perhaps they could be arranged chronologically, as if like a conventional indoor museum that would have a temporary and permanent collections. So I was also looking at it seasonally, and how that might affect tourist patterns, and looking again at a larger scale kind of light infrastructure will allow this flexible curation of an open-air museum. Some imagery of, again, speculating one way in which these churches could be stored for a period of time, permanently or temporarily. The project kind of became as much strategical as it was lyrical, whilst providing a commentary on the current state of these churches. This image is of the approach. So in the winter, the lake freezes over, Lake Onega freezes over. And again, looking at the different types of approach for the tourist and for the visitor onto the island. And with the architecture that I was producing, I kind of wanted to, in terms of materiality and form, I still want that to be very much informed by the buildings that are being put on the island. So I was looking at pitch pine and aspen, which is locally sourced from the mainland. So I was looking at a variety of scales and medium models, doing different surveys and drawings, which was really informing the project. And now currently, now working on a project which has kind of been off the back of my thesis work, to work at a scale 1-to-1. And I'm collaborating with the charity Wooden Architecture at Risk and a few people from Russia and from the UK. And the aim of the project is to increase awareness of what we might lose in 15 years. And the Russian Art Project the idea is to prefabricate Levitan's church, which has been lost for about 200 years now, and prefabricated in northern Russia and reassemble it here in the UK, potentially in London and throughout, and almost similar to close thing, kind of the Tin Tabernacle, having this prefabricated church that can actually move around and have exhibitions and conferences and awareness, but to really, again, highlight the awareness for what's happening in northern Russia, and try and make a change. And these are just some drawings, some early paintings that we're attempting to use to reconstruct the chapel.
Thank you. Thank you. Of course, I guess I should mention that this was probably an unusual year in which all the medals went to one school of architecture, the Bartlett School. Has that ever happened before, David? No. No. Oh, well, shows you the strength of the school. But going back to Ben's project, Joseph, I was intrigued about its notions of preservation and heritage and context. I mean, do you have any thoughts on that for Ben?
Well, I was wondering, are the islands now completely depopulated?
So,
are the islands completely depopulated?
Kiji Island has a very, very small population, about 12 people at the moment.
And what they live fishing?
They work basically for the existing museum there.
Yeah, I see. Okay, so they're on tourist industry, yes, rather than either fishers or cultivators. Yeah. No, conditions are very harsh, and people just left. I think it's just one of those interesting problems of depopulated and yet built up areas. I suppose there's no way of considering repopulating the islands with other than a restoration industry.
I think for islands that are closer to cities such as Petrus of Oz,
Yes.
but for predominantly for where these churches are coming, the majority of them are kind of far in the kind of either up in the Arctic Circle or really far in the middle of nowhere. And in those areas, you can't really fight. The depopulation, derural, people are moving away from there, and that's had a long impact from Soviet occupation.
Did they ever serve a population? Was there a large population in the islands?
The island, no, the island has a long history. It used to be a site of pagan worship, and it was always kind of seen as a kind of a sacred space of gathering, but with a small population. But it was never overly populated. So yeah, I think it's always been seen as a place of gathering, and that whether it's through religion, or whether it's kind of slowly become this kind of museum.
Alexander, David, questions for that?
Thank you. It's along the same lines, actually, and I want to start by saying that I think it's an extraordinary project, and there's no doubt that, already you're doing something off the back of that, I think, very appropriately. But I want to challenge a little bit some of the things that you said and the nature of this project, which, all things said and done, might end up being, the only way forward, a kind of mini Bilbao effect for Kiji Island. But something sort of bothers me a little bit, because you were very eloquent in your critique about the picturesque, the aestheticization, but then you're proposing a museum and curation, which are absolutely aestheticizing and objectifying and decontextualizing those things that they're trying to preserve. And of course this could very well be the paradox of, you know, our late modern condition. But I wonder, since very appropriate and sensible as this project is, it is ultimately a school project. If there was a way of thinking around it, and rather than proposing ultimately a museum and something that targets a kind of more temporary and fleeting, I can't think of the word, so, you know, one minute it's here, the next day it isn't, type of industry, which is the tourist industry, if you might have thought around it in terms of perhaps setting up a school for restoration, or workshops that perhaps begin to give incentives around those churches, but begin to give incentives for people to perhaps move permanently there, or at least seasonally.
And it's something I considered, and to an extent in the plan there are kind of accommodation for students to come on, and that's what I was trying to call a research facility, a restoration facility, where international research can be done on these buildings as they're coming in, and these different specimens are coming in. Yeah, it was, from doing this initial research into landscape and scenographic approaches with dialogic, I did come to this paradox of, and it was really negotiating between one and the other. You know, the main fact is, what do you do with all this heritage? Do you just select a few, or when I'm bringing onto the island, what happens to them? So I guess I was trying to do a bit of everything, and have exhibition, have kind of a tourist industry built up around it to finance the actual restoration of so many churches. But I guess I was trying to be careful and saying, well, actually, you know, this museum is actually is temporary, and having these churches on the island for a period of time, they might go back and they might find new uses, which might be even more evocative. You know, it's a long history of these churches, especially during Soviet occupation, to have different functional programmatic use. They were used as clubhouses, they were used as cinemas. Not suggesting maybe that's a use for them, but that was also one stage I'd probably like to explore as well, is that you know, we have these buildings, if they've been decontextualized, okay, they've been physically decontextualized, but they've already been decontextualized because there's no one using them. And okay, they're placemakers, and they're very, you know, they're very inherent to the situation they're built in, but if there's nowhere to use them, well then, you know, they've already been brutally decontextualized. Why can't they have new uses? Why can't they have new locations and find new meanings? So yeah, there was kind of a lot of things that I guess I could have done, and I was trying to kind of marry up the reality with my initial research and my initial kind of opinions.
Well, Ben, I think it occurred to me when you were speaking that actually all three of the projects that we've been discussing today deal with flight, or the potential for flight from established communities. I mean, they treat it all in different ways, but interestingly, that's the theme. And you know, just for the benefit of the audience, there was no conferring between juries. They took place on separate days in separate rooms with separate individuals. But I think the point Alexandra made a little bit earlier about an agenda which is essentially a social agenda emerging, I think, is something that I've noticed over the course of the last 5 to 6 years in the Netherlands. It's become very prevalent. Personally, I think this is a good thing. Architecture's losing its way at a rapid speed of knots in terms of its divorce from the social agenda and its embrace of marketisation. There's something that I have to ask about, which is that essentially you're dealing with relatively small to medium scale artifacts, these extraordinary churches produced with a single axe and with no incredibly sophisticated technology that's demountable and reconstructable. In a curious kind of way, the element that you introduced, the hangar, 5 big hangars, which kept echoing in my mind as being like those timber airship hangars, you know, that were produced in the southern states of America at a particular time. They don't get as much of a referencing, in a sense, as to what they are. Because you've got the aestheticised past of this new city of churches that you produce, what's the future of the hangars? I was struggling sometimes, much as I like them, I instinctively like them, but I can't quite know why, and I couldn't quite identify what they were, and actually how they sat in the future of Kizhi Island, which incidentally I think will turn into holiday homes for oligarchs. So, after they've made their money in Magneto, they can go to Kizhi Island.
I saw them, so, I mean, the architecture itself came from a lot of precedents. I was looking at, docks, and I was looking at Chatham Dockyard, I was looking at Wellesley Yacht House in New York. Like these, I mean, that was more of a kind of a practical solution of having a lot of timber coming onto the island. How would you have that? And I guess that's why they kind of kept a liminal quality as a kind of gateway in and off the island. And there is a kind of civic side of that, of kind of having this ongoing kind of artifacts kind of going through. And then at one point it kind of became very industrial, but it was really set by the parameters of having, say, 15 years for a large majority of the churches to come through. In the kind of future of them, I'd like to say a lot of them would stay there because a lot of these churches are kind of under a constant state of maintenance. They don't just come in and fix and go out and that's it. But it's an ongoing process, and that's why I thought kind of a facility, research facility, was quite interesting because approaches to heritage and stuff are going to constantly change in the way in which the technologies they use to restore these churches. Now they still have the axe, but restoring these they have new technologies developed from that. So I saw it as a permanent facility that will remain there throughout a long period of time.
I mean, the heritage lobby would say, well, actually, the ends justify the means. We've solved this problem of restoration. I think the question, it was alluded to earlier, I think Joseph made, this question about repopulation is actually fundamental. That's the next strategic question that has to be asked. Because it begs the question, I think, about all heritage projects.
It's interesting, David, because in not necessarily searching for a thing, but I was very aware of that, the social dimension to each of the, and I'm sort of recall, I think it was a few years ago now, when I think it was a Building Futures report that was done by the Building Futures group, which was making the case for architects to rediscover that social thing. So I think it's really quite an interesting comment being made. But I think the other thing, the theme that occurred to me, was that this interrogation of the sort of historical context of the brief, and I just wonder whether the panel would like to comment on that. That seems to be another theme, the sort of awareness of the historical. Joseph?
Well, perhaps I should say that I was very seduced by the drawings of this project. The problem of the timber churches in the north of Russia has always been a terrible problem because they need constant attention. That kind of timber structure does rot in places. It's not always very carefully constructed. So there are occasional building failures, but basically I think David's point is the fundamental point when, as an architect, you deal with this kind of situation, is who is going to look after them, and what is going to be the population that is going to occupy this particular area, and what are they going to live on? Are they just going to live on constant restoration, constant attention to the buildings and the tourist trade? Oligarchs don't have a very long life, if I may put it that way. The whole situation will probably, the social situation in Russia will change inevitably. And what then? You obviously can't plan for that because it's an unknown. But you can, as it were, further the next step. And that's not quite not quite foreseen in this project. Maybe it can't be.
Questions for Ben?
Really following on from Joseph's point, one of my concerns, although I love the scheme to bits, one of my concerns is perhaps the missing issue is there is no political vision. And two particular schemes which have similarities with this come to mind. One's in Austria, I think it's near Selbach, where there's a whole part of a hillside dedicated to Austrian farmhouses that go back 1,000 or more years. And there's farmhouse after farmhouse after farmhouse. The other example is St Fagans near Cardiff, which has got a whole wealth of Welsh buildings that have been restored, transformed, and improved. The Austrian example is an inventory, it's an archive, it's a scholarly approach to the issue of what is an Austrian farmhouse. Whereas St Fagans in Cardiff was developed with a political issue in mind, and that was to reinforce the evolution and the development of Welsh society. And the whole driving force behind St Fagans is the social agenda. Now, my argument would be that that is a much more sustainable approach to this type of restoration than one which is purely archival and dependent essentially on sponsorship.
Yeah, I mean, I agree to an extent that when I was doing research into other open-air museums, which are, some are contained museums and some are, within communities and with towns, they're part of it, integrated. And that was one thing I was slightly uneasy about, and I was kind of using the term aestheticized versions of the past. You take an open-air museum like in Williamsburg, it was very much based on ideals of nationalism that are kind of outdated now, but it's this physical manifestation that hasn't really adapted to that. And they have been struggling to adapt to accommodate the change of society. And I guess this, to an extent, this is an archive, but I was trying to maintain a kind of a degree of flexibility on the island, without prescribing, people will inhabit it this way or it will be curated this way, to try and kind of stand back and say, well, what kind of solution can I provide to create something that's very kind of has maybe a light infrastructure, which will allow ability to move in either way. And that you could argue that's just stepping back and allowing it to happen. But it's one thing I was very uneasy about, and still on the island now, that these festivals they have the kind of, I think, once a year on the island, are all about nationalism. And they're led down for the Ministry of Culture, and the new director of the museum has literally just dropped down from Moscow, whereas before it was someone kind of local in Karelia, which for me, I guess the Western I felt very uneasy about, using its architectural heritage as a particular kind of currency of culture in a political way. So, yeah.
Any further questions for Ben? Yeah.
I just have a few comments. I love the way you've done this project, and I really like what you're attempting to do. But if I were to use a facetious kind of analogy, it's like building a mechanics restoration shop and having a kind of used car lot at the end of the day. It's for me it raises a very weird question that I think we have to address, because I think the mechanics of what drives this kind of project is that we must restore everything that has been. Right? What draws us to what's really interesting about this project is the aesthetics of decay, that it's kind of fallen apart. And I think that's probably what drew you to that project, and the beautiful photograph that you had. Kind of weird though it might sound, it's beautiful that it's all kind of fallen apart. And I wonder whether the project could have been a curation of the decay of these churches rather than restoration. Because you're not really restoring the liturgical space or the communities or any of that sort of stuff. It's just the restoration of the building.
But yeah, how I came across First Work was through imagery and also photographs. And as you said, photographs of this kind of romantic kind of idea of this kind of church that will kind of remain in this state forever because it's been documented. And I actually met the photographer, Richard Davies, and he published a fantastic book of all these churches, and he's spent 9 years surveying them as they are, and they're all in these kind of states of decline. And he said himself, well, you know, I've got nothing to photograph now if they were restored, because people wouldn't, you know, they wouldn't sell that idea. But the reality is you can't. I mean, how do you maintain a structure that is kind of, I guess it's the argument, you restored, you preserved, you conserve, and that's kind of one point I came to in kind of fork in my project. It was like, what do I do? Do I preserve them? Do I restore them? Especially as, you know, some of them carry scars of Soviet, as I said, Soviet occupation. They have graffiti in them. They've been modified and appropriated to become clubhouses. So how do you restore them? Do you preserve them back to their former glory as kind of portrayed in Levitan's painting, or do you accept that and you know? And for me, I would say actually, if it was an institute of preservation, maybe it should be an institute of preservation, restoration, and conservation, and actually all those things should be drawn together, because no one is right and no one is wrong. So I mean, I guess that's, I mean, the decision I took was to allow for that.
Thanks very much indeed, mate. Thank you. I guess we need to conclude now, but I just wanted to say one of the, I think the two particular delights in any presidential year is the presidential medals and the Royal Gold Medal, and bringing the two together on an occasion like this is just a really lovely experience for a president. So I wanted to thank Tamsin, Ness and Ben for your presentations. Thank you to Joseph Moore this evening, when the Gold Medal, Royal Gold Medal will be presented, to Alexandra and David, and thank you to all for coming this morning. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.